Good morning and welcome to the DGAP morning briefing. My name is Tim Hofmann. I am editor at the magazine Internationale Politik, published by the DGAP. Today we want to focus on nuclear developments that are reshaping the strategic landscape in Europe, centered on France's new nuclear doctrine that President Emmanuel Macron introduced as forward deterrence a few weeks ago, and in the Middle East, where the ongoing war carries serious nuclear implications. A quick recap. Earlier this month, Macron laid out his vision for France's nuclear future in a speech at the Elan nuclear submarine base. In short, under this new concept of forward deterrence, France will deepen its cooperation with European allies through joint exercises and planning, including through a newly established Franco-German nuclear steering group. One of the most significant strategic shifts is the possible deployment of French strategic assets, including nuclear-capable ones, to the territory of other European states. Macron also announced that France will increase the number of warheads in its arsenal. Given the growing anxieties in Europe over the credibility of US extended deterrence, Macron's speech had been anticipated for some time, and without a doubt, it could turn out to be a turning point in Europe's security architecture. But it landed in a crowded news cycle. Just 2 days earlier, the US and Israel had jointly attacked Iran, triggering a war in the Middle East that is still ongoing with no clear end in sight. Against this backdrop, civilian and military international experts are meeting in Paris at the third edition of the Paris Defense and Strategy Forum, a conference designed to provide a platform for strategic thinking and forward-looking debates in Europe. Not surprisingly, the future of nuclear deterrence in Europe and the situation in the Middle East rank high on the agenda. Today, in fact, is the third and the final day of the forum. So in today's morning briefing, we want to pick up some of the topics discussed in Paris with a focus on nuclear developments in Europe and the Middle East, and we want to place them in the context of current dynamics in Franco-German relations. To connect all of these threads, I'm very pleased to introduce an excellent panel. First, we have Héloïse Fayet, Research Fellow and Head of the Deterrence and Proliferation Program at the Institut français de Relations Internationales, Ifri. Her research covers nuclear deterrence, proliferation of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, as well as strategic competition in the Middle East. Before joining Ifri, Héloïse worked as an analyst on the Middle East at the French Ministry of Armed Forces and at the French National Cybersecurity Agency. Good morning. Next up is Emmanuel Maitre, Senior Research Fellow at the Foundation for Strategic Research, where she focuses on issues of nuclear non-proliferation, deterrence, and disarmament. Her previous positions include inter alia the Center for Arms Control Studies and the Brookings Institution. Also, good morning to you. And finally, my colleague and frequent guest in the morning briefing series, Jakob Ross. Jakob is a research fellow in the Europe Center here at DGAP, focusing on French foreign and security policy, Franco-German relations, and the French far-right political parties. Before joining DGAP, Jakob worked at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and in the French National Assembly. Good morning to all of you. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. You know the drill. This meeting is being recorded and will be uploaded afterwards. As always, we will begin with 5-minute opening remarks from each speaker, followed by a moderated discussion with the questions from the audience, with questions from you. So please raise your hand if you have a question, or if you like, post it in the chat. Finally, a word of thanks to all my colleagues at DGAP who helped put this event together, including Helga Beck, Luise Rombach, Judith Ellensohn, and Jan Stöckmann. Without further ado, let's get started. Emmanuel, I would like to begin with your assessment of the new forward deterrence doctrine that is out there for about 3.5 weeks. I've briefly outlined some of the key changes that it entails, but perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more on the practical implications of this strategic shift, both for France and also for European partners. And perhaps you could also give us some context. How did we actually get there? Over to you.
Thank you very much, and very happy to be there this morning. Yeah, I think as you mentioned, the speech was very expected, and it's important to understand that it was expected for 2 reasons. The first one is that each president makes a speech during his term. So President Macron had already made a speech on deterrence in 2020, but he was re-elected, so it was quite normal, I would say, that he should make another speech. But really what I think was key also is the fact that the strategic context had changed so much in the 6 years that it was quite important for the government to revisit the deterrence, and they had also worked a lot on these issues during the 6 years. There had been many comments, many declarations. Strategic review was published over the summer. So it was kind of taking stock of all these evolutions and, of course, trying to adapt the doctrine to the new environment. So you mentioned already a couple of elements that I think are important to keep in mind. The speech is really quite innovative in some aspects, quite deep changes. It, of course, respects some of the fundamentals of the French deterrent, which remains, of course, defensive capacities. There is no war-fighting ability. It remains sovereign, fully independent. That remains, of course, a DNA aspect of the French deterrent. But there are some changes, one of which, as you mentioned, is the fact that the arsenal may be increased. We won't know exactly how many weapons are in the arsenals as of now. And of course, what drew some focus, and we are going to discuss now, the notion of forward deterrence. I think here again, it's something both innovative, but that also builds on a long history of considering that the French vital interests, which are determined by the president, which are the level at which a nuclear response might be considered, have a European dimension. This has been said by all most political leaders in the past, and it's been really built on to develop that concept. And it's interesting to see in the speech that Macron actually refers to the previous presidents, Mitterrand, de Gaulle, and so on. So really putting the historical background is quite important, and also working on what this administration has been doing for the past years, trying to have dialogues with European partners. So it's not something new that is coming on the table. It's more an effort to take stock of all the work that has been done for the couple of years to adapt to the changing environment and to try to envisage a way to work together on those issues. So what it does is really confirm that there will be cooperation on nuclear deterrence with 8 countries, which are named specifically. So, of course, the UK, we already had some elements in the summer, but also Germany, Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, Denmark, and Greece. This means that there will be specific tracks to discuss with those countries and to try to go further in sharing a strategic vision, sharing how an understanding of how escalation might work, and sharing also the conviction that there needs to be an additional layer of deterrence in Europe to be credible in the context of high threat that is perceived. More concretely, as you mentioned as well, some elements have been put forward, the participation of those countries in the French nuclear exercises, the possibility of temporary deployment of elements of the strategic air force to a foreign nation. And some element that I think we should emphasize also at this stage is, I think, a key factor, which is the idea that we might pool resources with those partner countries to make the French nuclear deterrence more credible with I would say, under the threshold. And that is the notion of shouldering, which is extremely important in the speech. The translation in English is maybe a little bit ambiguous, but it's the idea that you need conventional forces, conventional support to make sure that nuclear deterrence comes at the right level, and that you have abilities to answer to threats below the level, and therefore that your doctrine is credible. So this idea of a contribution of all the partners to this conventional shouldering is extremely important. There are 3 elements that have been mentioned by the president in the speech, but it was already, I would say, in the air in previous strategic documents, the idea of early warning, air defense, and conventional long strike. So maybe to wrap up those introduction remarks, I would say it's quite important and what we get from the speech is that it's not a logic of just nuclear umbrella. We are going to protect European countries. We are going to extend deterrence. I think it's really more an idea of mutual contribution to European security, where France is bringing its nuclear deterrent. The UK, by the way, is also bringing nuclear deterrent, but other countries are taking part and enhancing the global capacities to defend the continent. So I think that's really the philosophy here is quite clear. What we are going to be looking forward as of now is, of course, to what extent other partners may be interested in joining the mechanism. It's not close to the list of 8 countries, of course, and to what extent there is a willingness that we can expect in having some communication on the implementation, whether it is how the formal mechanisms that will be put in place, the dialogue you mentioned, the exercises, the signaling that we can get from those announcements.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And we will come back to the question of conventional support later. But for now, I would like to bring Héloïse in, and I would like to stay for a moment with the European side of things. What was your first reaction to Macron's speech, and was there anything that perhaps surprised you? Over to you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me on this panel. First, I think a lot of things has been said by Emmanuel already, of course. So what surprised me during the speech, or what I remember from the speech, first, I think it was a well-balanced exercise because it was pretty tricky for President Macron to, let's say, answer the questions for the Europeans, especially after teasing so much the speech. I mean, President Macron talked about the speech during the Munich Security Conference. It was only 2 weeks before the speech. And as it has been said, it was long awaited by European partners. So I guess the expectations from the European partners were high. And I think they were partly answered. Meaning that the media coverage and the reactions from the partners, and especially allies countries that were quoted in the speech, like clearly mentioned in the speech, were pretty positive regarding the Forward Deterrence Initiative. And on the other hand, President Macron also had to reassure the public opinion in France, and especially some far right and far left parties that were really, let's say, adamant against any sharing of the nuclear deterrent, and honestly, who spread a lot of fake news about the speech in the weeks before. And so afterwards, they all published statements saying that they were pretty reassured by the speech, and they will be, of course, very careful about never sharing the French nuclear deterrence. But as we said, it's on the point. And so I was positively surprised by the depth of the speech, especially this new concept of forward deterrence and the fact that 8 countries were clearly mentioned. But I was maybe a bit more disappointed, and we will talk about it later, by the, let's say, the small space that was allowed to conventional supports, to the, so épaulement, shouldering. It's also translated through mutual support between conventional and nuclear forces. And I was expecting something maybe a bit deeper, let's say, on this topic, not only focused on capabilities, just as early warning or DPS, but also the concept of, for example, deploying conventional French troops abroad, and what does it make to the French nuclear deterrent. So yeah, it will be my main points on the speech.
Perfect, and we will come back to that, as I said. But for now, I would like to move on to the second regional dimension that we want to touch on today. That is the situation in the Middle East, a situation that is completely different compared to the one in Europe regarding nuclear questions that we have right now. Different questions are being discussed. But Héloïse, with your regional expertise, I wanted to give the audience the chance to get your take on what are the most consequential developments regarding nuclear issues in the Middle East that we see right now, and perhaps also your read on the extent to which these developments are relevant also for the European context.
Yeah, so of course it's very important to keep in mind that Macron's speech is not related to the one in the Middle East. As we said, it has been planned for a while, and honestly, we might have been a bit disappointed that the media coverage just after the speech was mostly focused on the Middle East and not so much on the speech itself. Still, I think we can draw for the moment 3 lessons from what's happening in the Middle East regarding nuclear issues. Well, first, and it's not a specific point, of course, the nuclear imminent threat from Iran is merely a pretext for Israel and the US to act. I mean, it's very clear based on intelligence reports and what we knew about the Iranian nuclear program that there was no concrete threats of Iran developing a current, like a real nuclear device, or even more a nuclear weapon that it could use against Israel or another country. So there is a big difference, I think, between the war that we saw in June 25, that was really more focused on the nuclear sites, nuclear facilities, more focused on the military targeting, especially from Israel, and the situation that we see now that is much broader, with maybe more confused war objectives from the US and from Israel, and that is not at all focused on the nuclear program of Iran. But as I was saying, 3 lessons, I think, that we can draw from this conflict, and that is also, I think, reliable or at least relevant for Europe. First, the threshold for nuclear use is, of course, very high. At least meaning from Israel. We of course know that Israel is a nuclear weapon state, even though they don't talk about it. But we see that Israel is okay with enduring a lot of damages, regular strikes on its territory, missile strikes, drone strikes, without never, let's say, trying to convey the message that they could use nuclear weapons. They don't do nuclear signaling at all. And so the nuclear threshold for nuclear use, and especially for Israel, is very high in this framework. The second point would be, of course, the weakness of the conventional deterrence by Iran, meaning that the main pillars of the conventional deterrent from Iran were its ballistic missile arsenal that was partly depleted through the Israeli strikes in 24, in 25, and now in 26. Also, the lack of accuracy of its ballistic missile program, facing a very high level of missile defense in Israel. The second pillar was the network of proxies established by Iran in the Middle East, and it was also partly destroyed by Israel since October 23. And so Iran was not able to rely on this network to deter any attacks on its territory. And the third pillar of this deterrent strategy was also what we call nuclear latency, meaning the capability for Iran to go quickly towards a bomb if the political decision was taken. And so we see that the 3 pillars were partly destroyed, and so the threat to proliferate was not enough anymore to deter attacks on Iran. So yeah, second lesson, conventional deterrence is not enough to protect your own territory, especially facing 2 military powers like Israel and the US. And I would say the third lesson may be the fact that nuclear sites are more easily targeted than before. Of course, it's something that we can also see in Ukraine, with regular targeting and even occupation of nuclear power plants, Ukrainian nuclear power plants by Russia. The most famous case would be, of course, the nuclear power plant of Zaporizhzhia. And even though Natanz and Fordo or Isfahan are not nuclear power plants, it's still a nuclear site that are supposed to be protected under the international law, and they are still targeted by Israel and the US. It's the same for Israel, of course. Their nuclear facilities were targeted by Iran, Dimona, during the weekend. But of course, it would not have the same consequences regarding, for example, a nuclear accident. It would not be the same, of course, to target or to provoke, let's say, a nuclear incident in Natanz, or even worse, in the nuclear power plant of Bushehr. In Iran, the risks are way higher than targeting Dimona. So I think it's going to be a very serious topic at the NPT REFCON, so the review conference of the Treaty of Non-Proliferation that's going to start in a couple of weeks, the safety and security around nuclear power plants. And I think it's something that we should be wary about in Europe.
Thank you very much for this spotlight. Very, very helpful. Jakob, let me hand over to you for perhaps connecting these two threads by sharing some insights from Paris, from the Paris Defense and Strategy Forum. Let's start with the topic of nuclear deterrence in Europe. There is a lot of momentum right now. What were the conversations in Paris like, and what does the mood tell us about where the Franco-German relations stand following Macron's speech? Over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning to everybody. Maybe first point is that the speech by Macron in early March and the joint declaration, which was quite ambitious, frankly, which surprised many observers. And I'm not an expert on nuclear issues, but I was surprised by the ambitious language, what Chancellor Maitre said about potential conventional German forces joining nuclear exercises in France as early as this year. I didn't expect that, and I think very few other people did. And this whole nuclear deterrence and Europeanization or European dimension of French nuclear deterrence is really, or has become, the beacon of hope for Franco-German relations in general, which were at a low point since the beginning of the year, frankly. We had several conflicts on major issues, the question of Russian assets in Europe, European diplomatic initiatives towards the Kremlin, Mercosur trade deal, the major defense procurement projects, FCAS and MGCS, which are still in shambles. And so this nuclear speech and Franco-German initiative, but broader European initiative, really came at the right time. Now, to share some insights here from conversations at the Paris Defense and Strategy Forum, unfortunately, not so many conversations with German participants. The German delegation is still tiny. I hope this will change in the coming years. I think from the French side, there's a renewed impression that Berlin is finally ready to take some risks, to step forward with regards to nuclear deterrence and these conversations, to signal to the US allies that Germany is taking these alternatives seriously, that there's a serious effort to build alternatives in case US guarantees might falter. And the second point is that there's increasing pressure on the timeline. Since if we assume that Macron's initiatives of Europeanizing the idea of French sovereignty, efforts to convey that to the French public, to the political party system, has only a couple of months left, this increases the pressure on the Franco-German couple, which has been the case for years, but also on the European conversation broadly. And I would like to insist on 3 points which struck me as a participant here in Paris on these 2 days, the past 2 days at the forum. The first one is that high-ranking French officials from several ministries, MFA, but also the Ministry for the Armed Forces, really conveyed and insisted on the fact that France is a trustworthy ally, that France is, if it is linked to a partner country through a common framework, a NATO, EU, or a bilateral defense agreement, that France is there if push comes to shove. There were several examples throughout the conversations. The first one, and Héloïse has touched upon that, being the situation in the Middle East. The fact that France has been very quick, also compared to Germany, not only in evacuating its own citizens from Gulf states, for instance, which has been a conversation in Germany as well, but also signaling its readiness to bring the Air Force in to secure allied partner states in the region, or not ally states, but states that are linked to France by bilateral defense agreements, to shoot down Iranian drones. The French aircraft carrier has been sent to the region, so a lot of signaling. The second point or example for this trustworthiness being conveyed here in Paris over these past 2 days was Greenland. Denmark is this year's strategic partner of the forum. A lot of Danish officials, high-ranking military staff, but also Danish ministers attending the forum, and the fact that France indeed has been very present in the Greenland debate. At the beginning of the year, France has, since the threats made by the Trump administration, opened a consulate in Greenland. France has sent troops. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot has been very outspoken about European readiness to defend Greenland in case that there would really be an invasion or some kind of takeover, which struck me as a very important point, since I have personally assisted conversations in Berlin where I got the impression that the French side was taking these threats very seriously, whereas the German side was not really contemplating even the idea that the US could really move on these threats and send troops to Greenland, say. A third point for this conveying of trustworthiness is the fact that France is still communicating on the coalition of the willing with regards to Ukraine, that these conversations are ongoing close to Paris. I think the French chief of the general staff, the CEMA, Fabien Mondon, mentioned that representatives from militaries across Europe are still regularly meeting close to Paris to prepare the day after a ceasefire might be reached in Ukraine and to provide these security guarantees. So France is really insisting on this role throughout several theaters and conflicts around the territories of the European Union. Now, to come to an end, the only question, and increasingly the main question being asked in Franco-German relations with regards to nuclear deterrence, with regards to French initiatives on these conflicts, is increasingly what the 2027 presidential election might bring. This is really becoming very apparent, has been a big topic of conversations, not on stage at the Paris Defense and Strategy Forum, but off stage. I overheard a lot of conversations on this, and is increasingly becoming a problem for President Macron, which, I mean, is an obvious fact, but the window of opportunity is quickly closing. We just had communal elections in France. Everybody was screening for signals how the parties might be positioned for the 2027 presidential elections. And I think everybody, last sentence, including in Berlin, is very conscious that starting in September, I guess, France will be out of many of these conversations because the country will be focused on the electoral cycle and the presidential campaign in April 2027. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakob. And that your last point is actually a perfect segue into the Q&A. When we look at the political landscape in France, in thinking about also this new vision, what Macron laid out, how durable do you think this political commitment will prove to be, having in mind, you said it, the upcoming presidential elections in France, and how likely is that a Eurosceptic successor could reverse this new doctrine? I mean, Héloïse already alluded to the reactions by the far right and also by the far left to the speech. What do you think about the durability of this new vision?
Well, I go first, and then because I mean, obviously our French guests are maybe much more knowledgeable on that as well. But I mean, again, this was a big topic at the forum. I'm always surprised to compare the foreign and security policy consensus that still exists in France to the German discussion, because I think that with regards to nuclear deterrence, with regards to the armed forces, there still is a very strong consensus in France, spanning really from the far left to the far right. I mean, that there are, threats at times and politicization. Héloïse alluded to the fact that there has been some fake news spread by some of these political actors. But I think at the end of the day, And you saw that in reactions from Rassemblement National, mainly, I mean, everybody's focused on them, a bit to a lesser degree, maybe on La France Insoumise, on the far left side of the political spectrum. But these reactions were fairly reasonable to Macron's speech. I mean, they were not pushing against the idea that France's nuclear deterrence might have a European dimension, and this dimension might be strengthened going forward. And I mean, I am under the impression, or I've come under the impression recently after conversations as well with people from Rassemblement National, that they are trying to, you know, to moderate, to get to the political centers, to signal to French public, but also increasingly to European partners that a Rassemblement National, a national election win would not mean that all of these initiatives will be scrubbed. From a German viewpoint, this would be a huge change, because in 2022, the Rassemblement National electoral program included the end of FCAS and MGCS, for example. There has been a lot of anti-German rhetoric in the past. But I think that nowadays, the main leaders at Rassemblement National really try to signal to European partners that it wouldn't be this huge break that many people are fearing. And again, last point, I increasingly hear, and I mean, again, that's not a very, very original thought, but that the Italian example might be used, you know, by these people to say, look, Giorgia Meloni was framed as a post-fascist or fascist 4 years ago. Now she's a main strategic partner for the Merz government. So look how fast things can change once people get elected into office. And I think Rassemblement National, or at least the foreign policy, defense policy people at Rassemblement National, that are still very few. I think they still have big problems to gain expertise on these issues, but that they are trying to get this Meloni frame of being responsible and willing to talk about these initiatives launched by Macron.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And Héloïse, I saw you nodding. Would you like to add to what Jakob just said? Perhaps starting with Emmanuel. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just really supporting what Jakob said. Just maybe 2 elements to add. The first is that the French far right has traditionally been very against NATO, against the US. So, of course, that can also be used to some extent to say that whatever stands, and that is not NATO in Europe, to defend Europe, can be useful. So it would be an argument to really go in the direction of what Jakob said. Now, I would also add an element of caveat and maybe a little bit of skepticism, because of course we know that the populist parties are always difficult to be seen as credible partners, because they might change their minds a lot. And of course, the impression, the image is quite difficult to understand. We know that the French far right has been traditionally very close to Russia. So what the stand they would take on Ukraine would be very important to bring credibility to the whole mechanism. So I here again, the difference between what is actually done on the ground, whether or not the dialogues keep going, whether or not the policy is changed, that is an important element. But the narrative, or the impression that partners would get from the fact that we have an elected official who has been more or less close to Russia, quite critical of Ukraine, that would be, of course, quite important to bring credibility to the whole mechanism.
Yeah, and maybe a quick point to add, if I may. That's why it's very important also to create now all these steering groups and these, let's say, habits and routines of cooperation and coordination with other countries. Because if a far-right government comes into power next year, it will be much more difficult for them to undo what has been already done. And so, of course, we might not expect some new additions to the forward deterrence doctrine, or maybe some new countries joining in. But at least if we move now quite quickly, we have, let's say, a year left, it will be more difficult for them to undo something that is already done.
Thank you very much. And I would like to encourage the audience again to think about questions, post it in the chat, raise your virtual hand. Our experts are here to answer your questions. But for now, I would like to come back to the part that you said about the conventional support, this sort of mutual support. I think it's a very, very important element because Macron, he not only offered extended deterrence to European allies, but he also set some concrete expectations for his partners. And you mentioned already the kind of conventional capabilities that you mentioned, early warning systems, air and missile defense, deep precision strike. My question is, what is the strategic rationale behind this, and what does it mean in practice for countries like, let's say, for example, Germany or also Poland? Emmanuel, would you like to have a first shot at this question?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think there are two elements really that we a little bit alluded to. The first one is that any strategic capacity, deterrence capacity, needs some conventional forces to work. You need some refueling planes. You need some ships that are going to help the submarines get into the sea so they can dilute into the oceans. You need plenty of forces that are conventional but are necessary for the deterrence to actually work. So that's one aspect. The second aspect of conventional force is that any country, here again, that has developed a nuclear strategy in the past has noticed that you have a threshold, but you know that, of course, you may be vulnerable under the threshold to attacks that may not maybe reach your vital interests, but still be very problematic for your country. And of course, Héloïse mentioned the case of Israel right now, and we see that every single day, a nuclear weapon state that is attacked under its nuclear response threshold. And if you just give the president the option of having a nuclear response or doing nothing at all against this type of attacks, you put the president in a very difficult situation. So there is the incentive to develop conventional capacities, not to wage a full Third World War kind of type of conflict at the conventional level, but at least to deter any attack that would not reach the threshold. So these two logics have been, historically pushing for the acquisition of some level of conventional forces. I think in France, it was a little bit sometimes difficult to admit, because there was a little bit in the narrative this idea that nuclear forces are so powerful that we can deal with many, many threats with that. But for many years, increasingly, the armed forces have been open about the need to develop these capacities. Obviously, because the French nuclear deterrent is independent and needs to stand on its own by itself, France needs to have some level of conventional capacities by itself to be able to operate its forces alone. But it's been recognized now for a couple of years. It is obviously more efficient, more able if it integrates some forces from the partners. So that's really, I think, the logic that we are seeing here being expressed slowly over the years and emphasized in the speech, is that while France can do it alone, it will be more credible if it adds and if it can rely on the force of its partners. And therefore, we enter into a phase of real mutual support. And I think that's really the philosophy, once again, of the speech.
If I may add to that, I think we can also draw a distinction between support, European support to specific French nuclear operations. And so in that regard, it will be participation of European aircraft to a nuclear raid, for example, refueling planes. It can be also providing intelligence, surveillance. It can be providing suppression of enemy defenses, something that France doesn't have by itself for the moment. But there is, of course, a delicate balance to find between, as Emmanuel said, France still needs to be able to do it by itself, but also demonstrating to the adversary that if all European countries go together, it will be more efficient. But this is specifically, I think, about the nuclear operation itself, while on the other hand, we also need this conventional nuclear deterrence articulation, like in always, in a permanent framework, let's say, not only during a nuclear raid, of course, otherwise we will never do it, hopefully. So it means, for example, developing together some projects that are able to impose costs on the adversary, but without going to the nuclear threshold. So President Macron talked about deep precision strikes. He was, of course, referring to the ELSA project, the European long-range strike approach, that has been launched, I think, a bit more than 2 years ago, and is not going anywhere for the moment, unfortunately. Also, early warning, it's related to the Dual project that was launched between France and Germany, but it can be really broader than that. And so we were talking about conventional deployments abroad. So it's a big part. It's a big part of it, and going towards a better, not a full repartition, let's say, of capabilities in the European context. But, you know, if Poland decides to continue with developing a very strong land forces, how is it articulated to the nuclear deterrence of France, of the UK? How can we do escalation management together? And it will be really the goal of these nuclear steering groups that are established between France and other countries, especially Germany. It will be the framework, the fora to talk about it.
Thank you.
I can just,
yes,
sorry, Tim, if I can just add 2 points from the German perspective that struck me as very important. First one being, I think, if I remember correctly, that President Macron even mentioned the European Sky Shield initiative positively, which from a German point of view was huge. I mean, it was the source of much animosity ever since Scholz had presented this as his, lighthouse initiative back in 2022, and now it was included, which again opens a door to the German discussion to really get on board with the idea of discussing nuclear deterrence with the French. And the second point, again from a Berlin perspective, very hugely important, was the positive reaction from the United States. As far as I saw it, that the US was not reacting as many people in Berlin have thought in the past, or have pretended to think in the past, that the US would immediately get jealous and, threaten to pull out of the sharing mechanisms, nuclear planning group in NATO, but really reacted positively. And even in the Trump administration, in the hardcore MAGA circles, on the basis of saying that the Europeans are finally, this is all part of the Europeans getting their act together, strengthening, sovereign decision-making and defense with regards to the Russian threat. And so I think it will be immensely difficult for German officials going forward to use this argument that the US will pull out of the German, American or NATO mechanisms to engage in a conversation with the French, which has been the case for many years, I think, and that was a very positive signal coming out of this whole sequence, I think.
Thank you, Jakob. And since Héloïse, you mentioned this new nuclear steering group, I think it's very interesting because this is one of the really tangible institutional changes that we will see. You already said a little bit about the objective, but perhaps you could also tell us a little bit more about what do we know about some other practicalities, its starting date, composition, and perhaps also the integration into existing structures, for example, in the NATO context. Is there any sort of idea to integrate these structures?
Yeah, so for the moment, we don't have a clear view of when this steering group is going to be established, at least on my own point of view. I don't have specific information about it, but at least on the French as a French MFA, they are really boosting up the number of people who are going to deal with all these steering groups. But for sure, I think it's going to be the first established between France, in this framework. So we already have something with the UK, but we cannot really mirror the one that we have with the UK to the German model, because of course with the UK we talk about coordination between all nuclear deterrence, and Germany doesn't have nuclear weapons. So for the moment, we don't have a starting date yet. But I think it could start maybe with the participation of German officials to a poker operation, poker exercise. So it's a quarterly exercise of the French nuclear air force. We had British officials participating in it last December, and so maybe we should expect by the summer German officials to participate in this exercise. And regarding the articulation with NATO, so I think President Macron was was quite clear in his speech, explaining that the forward deterrence was fully compatible with NATO, and it was providing again this kind of additional layer of security guarantees. We had also a NATO official that said just after the speech that yes, it was fully compatible. But for the moment, of course, it's not a way, I think, for France to enter the NATO nuclear planning group. I really don't see that on the agenda. But maybe we could count, let's say, on the European partners and allies to maybe talk to us more about what's happening in the NPG, and also European allies to talk about what they are doing with France on the NPG. But again, it's not because we won't have French nuclear weapons deployed in other countries except in a time of crisis. It's not a way to mirror the NPG. It's not the same needs. And so, yeah, I don't see for the moment any issues with having this kind of bilateral discussions and the NPG, on the other hand, that is more focused on managing the US presence, and especially the US nuclear presence in Europe. And I see also a lot of questions in the chat, so if you want us to address that.
Yes, I just wanted to. There's a question by Helmut Hofmann, and that fits also nicely with a question that I have in mind. So his question is, what is the French take of debates in Germany about seeking an own European or even a German nuclear deterrent? And the question that is connected to that is if Macron's proposal is actually sufficient to prevent individual European states, for example, thinking also about Poland, from pursuing their independent nuclear capabilities. Emmanuel, perhaps we start with you and then Héloïse.
Yeah. Indeed, I think that the two questions are interestingly linked. On the second one, it's clear that we can understand that there might be some level of disappointment or some level of expectations that are not met. But to some extent, I think the reservations, the limits are quite understandable in a way that no president, no French president, but even no US president has ever committed to definitely use nuclear weapons in support of any types of aggression. The idea that there's always a form of ambiguity is always part of the deterrence equation, and therefore this demand that there would be an automatic commitment or an automatic or more, I would say, an integration of partners in the decision making is unfortunately, I think, very hard to satisfy. For deterrence reason, the fact that at the end of the day, it's deemed to be more efficient if it's one person who decides and with a level of ambiguity. And of course, for a political reason in France, where I think the idea that it remains a very sovereign capacity is absolutely there's a clear red line here that is not ambiguous at all, and so it would really carry out more risks than anything else to be too forward-leaning on this aspect. So therefore, it puts the question of, well, there's always a risk for the partners countries that France may actually not decide to come to their support. And the answer, I think, unfortunately, will remain yes. And it was already the case for extended deterrence. And I mean, it remains the case for NATO extended deterrence. There's always a question of whether or not the country would commit. I think the integration, political, economical, military, the fact that France would definitely be involved in the conventional conflict to support its European partners means that the chances are greater than there would be a response. But there's always a question. So then, of course, this idea that national nuclear forces might be more efficient is probably going to remain something that is heard as long as the level of threat is that high. Now, I think here we need to look at really the costs of such an idea, which are huge for the country involved, but would really carry the risk of dividing or even, I think, breaking an alliance in the EU. If a country decided to go nuclear, it would probably mean the end of any military cooperation, any type of, I mean, maybe some countries would still support it, but others would not. And so the division would be so big that it would probably be extremely detrimental for everybody. So the cost of a nuclear deterrent program, I think, would be is still works as a deterrent to not launch this type of initiative. And I think France is very clear at the diplomatic level on that aspect. It was interesting in the speech to see that President Macron did mention the fact that maybe his propositions were actually acting as a way to prevent this kind of proliferation speech. But I think that the tension and the concern is logical, is understandable, and will remain. The logic of costs should hopefully keep states from actually embarking in this type of programs.
Yes, so fully agree with Emmanuel, and I think it's also important to keep in mind that all European countries are signatories of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the only country that tried to withdraw from the NPT, that is, as they are allowed to do it, is North Korea. So I don't think any European country would like to become like North Korea and having maybe sanctions imposed on them because they would have left the NPT. I also think sometimes this kind of declarations stem from maybe a misunderstanding of, again, the cost of developing nuclear weapons, the technical difficulties, and the fact also that 1 or 2 nuclear weapons doesn't make a nuclear deterrent. It's very important to have that in mind. If you don't have like a credible doctrine, a credible arsenal through, for example, nuclear testing, or at least demonstrations, it can make you, in fact, more vulnerable to attacks in a very short period between the fact that you say, okay, I'm going to proliferate, and the fact that you have your nuclear weapons. You always have a time of vulnerability. In fact, as we see a bit in Iran, even though Iran never said they would develop nuclear weapons. So again, I don't think it's a good idea to encourage this kind of discourses that we can call friendly proliferation. It's also the same in South Korea, by the way, or in Japan. But I would not say to completely ignore them. Of course, they are completely legitimate calls for more reassurance, like a warning call, let's say. And so it's up to France, to the UK, and also, of course, to the US to maintain a very strong, credible, extended deterrence to their allies and partners in order to prevent any thoughts about domestic proliferation, or also like the famous European deterrent that doesn't make any sense, because again, if you don't have one person deciding on using a bomb, but if you have to ask the 27 members of the EU, you would never use a nuclear weapon, and so your nuclear deterrent is useless.
Jakob,
yes.
Would you like to add 1 or 2 sentences on the German perspective?
Well, just to jump in on what Héloïse just said on these propositions of a European nuclear deterrent, I think that has been a very weak point of the German discussion for a long time, and still recently. Not to point to a particular political party, I think there have been these propositions from many forces in the German parliament, but I would specify specifically Jens Spahn, who came out a year or 1.5 years ago, so the CDU's parliamentary group's leader, proposing a shared mechanism, decision-making mechanism for European nuclear deterrent. And I think these kinds of propositions are really the worst thing that Germans can contribute to the debate, because it was immediately picked up in the French debate, the far right, the far left, who said, okay, Germany wants to deplete us of our nuclear deterrent, just as they try to destroy our civilian nuclear industry. So, I mean, German politicians should really be very careful about what they say in public, because they might not notice it, but people in France are really following these debates in Germany, and they might misinterpret interpret them and use them for political discourse. And I think this caution should be strengthened going forward and approaching the 2027 presidential election. So really a call for all German politicians to refrain from making these kinds of statements for political points in the German debate. Other than that, I think that the only political force, as far as I saw in the German debate, who argued for a German nuclear deterrent and arguing indeed for going, the North Korean way of things, was the Alternative für Deutschland. It's not a common position within the far right in Germany, but there's several voices, including Rüdiger Lukassen, who's the spokesperson for the defense committee or defense policy at AfD, who in the past has, argued for a German deterrent, saying that Germany should not rely on either the US nor the French going forward. But it's a very minority position. But these voices exist in Germany. Yeah.
Thank you. With a look at the time, I would like to reserve some time for a concluding statement. But before that, there's a question by Basil Korotki in the chat, which I think is very important, and I would like to dedicate some time to it. He asked, given the massive numerical superiority and the diverse nuclear triad of the Russian arsenal, can France's relatively modest stockpile of approximately 300 warheads serve as a credible, independent deterrent for Europe, especially if extended to allies? And he adds, more importantly, would the Kremlin truly fear a European umbrella that lacks the strategic depth and tactical nuclear variety of the US? So very, very big question in the end. Perhaps we start with you, Héloïse, if you like.
Yeah, we are very used to this question. So first, it's very important to keep in mind that in the current context, France is not looking at replacing the US extended deterrence. We are very happy with the US extended deterrence being still there, credible, enforced both by conventional forces and nuclear forces. And so the current size and let's say the diversity of the French nuclear arsenal, that is indeed not so diverse, is made to, again, complicate the strategic calculus of Russia and provide additional security guarantees to European countries. It's not extending the French nuclear umbrella to allies because there is no French nuclear umbrella. It's really to think about how can the vital interests of France can be affected by what's happening beyond the French borders, because of course it's completely we cannot think now due to the integration of France and other countries in NATO or in the EU or bilateral agreements that we have, for example, with Poland or Germany, to think that half of Poland could be invaded and without any consequences on the French vital interest. So we would act because it has consequences on France. But if we were in a situation where the US would not be there anymore, with no conventional forces, no nuclear weapons deployed in Europe, and a complete change in the US rhetoric. For the moment, they still say that of course, they will defend Europe with nuclear weapons, and extended deterrence is still there. So if there is nothing left, then in that regard, yes, we might need to think about further adaptations to the French nuclear arsenal. But also maybe keep in mind that with 300 nuclear warheads, and even maybe a bit more if we were to extend the arsenal as it has been announced, and also counting on the UK nuclear deterrent, so it's more than 500 nuclear warheads all put together, you can still inflict considerable damage on Russia, and so we assess that yes, it's a credible nuclear deterrent in the current format, in the current situation. But if the US were to completely withdraw, we might need to think about something a bit different.
If I may just add up to what Héloïse said, just a little element to also understand how the threshold has been conceived by France over the years. It's always been the minimum level of forces that is able to create certain damage on an adversary, especially, of course, Russia, with the idea that with this level of damage, the adversary is fully convinced that it's absolutely not worth going with the attack in the first place. And therefore, the number of nuclear weapons that Russia has, or the fact that it's a huge country and that probably France would not be able to destroy it all fully and raze it to the ground, it doesn't really matter, because that's not what France is trying to do. It's just trying to, it aims at having the capacity to create, as Héloïse said, enough damage to make any attack absolutely without any purpose. And therefore, what matters really is how the French weapons would perform, to what extent they might be able to defeat defenses. And that is what is really considered, I think, by the planning teams here in France, looking at the defenses, to what extent the weapons would be able to defeat those defenses, to be sure to hit their targets. And that is really instrumental in defining the threshold. And whether or not the French vital interests are fully national or they go beyond the borders, it doesn't really change this equation of how many we need. I mean, the president needs to, in his eyes, create enough damage in Russia to make an attack absolutely absurd.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time a little bit, and there are many, many topics that deserve our dedication, our attention. But for now, I would like to give each of you time for a brief closing statement, about 30 seconds, with one final question to guide you. So looking ahead, what would you identify as the #1 priority, building on everything that has been said today, #1 priority for France and its European allies to make forward deterrence a success? And let's start in reverse order from the opening. Starting with you, Jakob, what would be your #1 priority going forward from now?
I mean, I would do what the French officials have tried here at the Paris Defense and Strategy Forum, is conceiving or conveying to European partners that European sovereignty and the Europeanization of French sovereignty is not attached to Macronism and Emmanuel Macron, but is a deeper movement that will continue beyond Emmanuel Macron's presidency, which to me is absolutely essential. If European partners and Germany, first and foremost, approaching 2027, get the idea that, you know, European sovereignty and France's initiatives of opening up to Europe are indeed an idea attached to Macron, then this whole idea will disappear in April 2027, which to me, from my perspective, would be really devastating news for the European debate, because we have come a long way since 2017.
Great. Héloïse.
Yeah, so I would say more conventional forces, and not only fancy capabilities like deep precision strikes or early warning, but also less sexy things like what we call strategic enablers. For example, tankers, military mobility, logistics, and also infantry, drones, meaning really creating a strong conventional deterrent in order to support nuclear deterrent, but without too much following, I think, what we see, for example, in Ukraine or in Israel. Of course, we can draw lessons from that, but we have to keep in mind that NATO is a nuclear alliance, that we will be facing maybe a nuclear country, meaning Russia, and so we have to be careful in what we can learn from other theaters. There are very interesting things to be learned, for example, the use of drones, connectivity, and stuff like that. But it doesn't mean that we need exactly the same things, especially in terms of missile defense, than other countries.
Yeah, maybe to finish at the political level, I think, and to bounce back on what Jakob said, definitely European countries have different interests, sometimes industrial interests, sometimes they might have different priorities given their regional environment, but really the ability to show that on the major issues, the major strategic interests, we manage to share a vision, and that this is quite consistent depending, and it doesn't change when there are some elections here or there, that the major vision of European countries that want to defend themselves together endures. I think it is extremely important. Sometimes we tend to focus on the fact that such country wants to sell these planes to others, or that this is, of course, this is important, this matters, but it's not the big picture, which in the environment of threats that we know needs to go much beyond this sometimes, I would say, short-term interests and really be built in the long run for bigger considerations.
Thank you. Excellent closing statements that perfectly set the scene for ongoing discussions. Thank you to our panelists for your insights, and also thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us and for your questions, of course. We will be back with our morning briefing series after a 2-week Easter break. If you like, you can already mark the 14th of April in your calendar. We will be discussing the results of the Hungarian parliamentary elections then. Take care, goodbye, and have a good day. Thank you.